Hello everyone. Welcome to the session on working with fabric grain. In this session, we will discuss the concept of fabric grain, its types and their uses. We will also learn how to identify each of the grain types and how to check the fabric grain before pattern layout. We will also cover in this session how fabric grain is represented through grain line and how to choose the right grain line for different garment components. So let us start the session. As we know, in the garment construction process, paper patterns of various parts of a garment are placed on the fabric and the fabric is cut in the shape of these patterns. The cut fabric pieces are stitched together to create a complete garment. And it is in this context that we need to understand the concept of fabric grain. In order to achieve a good fit, appearance, and drape of a garment, it is necessary to understand and use the correct fabric grain. Many a times, because of the incorrect positioning of the grain, the garment fit gets affected and it becomes uncomfortable to wear, or the hang of the garment may get disturbed. Once the fabric is cut, then it is very difficult to rectify such problems. Therefore, the knowledge of fabric grain and its correct use becomes fundamental to proper garment construction. Generally, when we speak of fabric grain, we are referring to woven fabrics. However, the concept of grain is also important in knitted fabric. At the same time, there are other fabrics such as non-wovens, felt and leather, where the concept of fabric grain is not applicable. Let us first look at the basic structure of a woven fabric to gain an understanding of fabric grain. Fabrics which are constructed through the process of weaving are called woven fabrics. Weaving is done by interlacing two sets of yarns, one in the lengthwise direction called warp yarns, and the other in the widthwise direction called weft yarns. So these warp and weft yarns go over and under each other at right angles to create a fabric structure. During the weaving process, weft yarns are passed over and under the warp yarns, thereby interlacing the two sets of yarns. So here we are going to discuss how to identify the alignment of grain and how to straighten the grain. So when we start with the pattern layout and look at the fabric and check the alignment of grain, that means an ideal alignment should be where the warp and weft are placed at right angles to each other. That means they are creating a 90 degrees angle. But sometimes you would find that the edge of the fabric is not falling in a straight line. So that means the warp and the weft yarns, they get displaced and the alignment gets disturbed. So to check the extent of misalignment, there are two ways. So for medium weight fabrics, plain fabrics, you can just snip at one edge, one corner, and just tear along this line in a fast movement. So just tear across the fabric from one selvage to the other, and then the fabric will tear along a single weft yarn, and you would be able to see how much misalignment is there. So in this case, the misalignment is not to that extent, but generally in case you find this way, you will be able to find that sometimes the fabric may be this angle of this particular weft yarn may not fall in a straight line and it may fall at an angle. So this is the first step to just understand the level of misalignment. So another way of identifying the level of misalignment is by pulling weft yarn a single weft yarn. So in case the fabric is very delicate, so what you can do is you can just pull out, a single weft yarn and along from one selvage to the other. So this is a very, time consuming method, and you have to do it very patiently and gently and pull it across and and here you will be able to see, if you see, you can see the path of that single weft yarn, and you can see that the edge it seems to be in a straight line, but actually it is misaligned, and the correct path is this. So you will get a straight edge. So the second step is simply to cut on this edge, follow this path, and so here, in both the cases, by tearing method and by pulling the weft thread, we've been able to identify the degree of misalignment. And in case the fabric or the angles are really, misaligned, what you need to do is you need to just stretch it diagonally and set the warp and weft in place, and try to set the angle right as much as possible. So here the fabrics are pretty much, they are already aligned properly, but in case the alignment is not there or the fabric is off grain too much, then you need to just pull it diagonally and stretch it till the edge falls in a straight line. Normally, stronger yarns are used as warp yarns because they are held under tension during weaving, while the weft yarns are more supple since they have to just pass over and under the warp yarns. Because of this, generally in a fabric specimen, the fabric is stronger and heavier along the length compared to width, whereas the width has more suppleness or elasticity or has more stretch compared to the length. You all must have noticed the woven fabric also has a self-finished edge along the length of the fabric. It is called selvage, and it prevents the fabric edges from unraveling. So basically, a woven fabric would have warp yarns along the length of the fabric, weft yarns along the width of the fabric, and selvages on both edges of the fabric. Fabric grain represents the direction in a woven fabric in which the pattern pieces are placed for fabric cutting. The direction or grain in which fabric is cut affects the appearance, fit, and hang of the finished garment, since each of the directions in the fabric has different set of properties. In pattern layout and fabric cutting, 3 types of grains are used: lengthwise or straight grain, widthwise or cross grain, and bias. The lengthwise grain direction is along the warp yarns, which are running parallel to the selvage of the fabric. The crosswise or widthwise grain direction lies along the weft yarns, running perpendicular to the selvage. So what if we come across a fabric, a random piece of fabric, where the selvage is not there, it is not visible, and we have to identify the warp yarns and weft yarns, and we need to understand, where is the lengthwise grain or the widthwise grain, because if we get to know the direction of warp yarns or weft yarns, then it is very easy to know, because we know that the warp yarns will form the lengthwise grain and the weft yarns would form the widthwise grain. So in order to identify the grain in a random piece of fabric, we can do a simple test called stretch test. So basically we just stretch along the different directions of the fabric, the lengthwise and the widthwise, and we just see how much it stretches, because we know that the warp yarns, they stretch, they have the minimum stretch because they are heavier and stronger than the weft yarns, and weft yarns are supposed to be more elastic. So let's try to stretch the yarns a little bit in each direction. So it stretches a little bit, and let me try from this here. The stretch is little more. It is pulling. We can see clearly that it is stretching a little more in this direction, and whereas in this direction the stretch is not that much. It is not stretching too much. So the direction in which the stretch is minimum, which is less, is the warp direction, and the direction in which you get more stretch, the fabric is stretching more, is the weft direction. That means in this piece of fabric, this is the direction of warp yarns or the lengthwise grain. The bias falls along any angle to the lengthwise or crosswise grain, and when the angle is 45 degrees, that direction or grain is called true bias. Let us now understand the properties of each of these grains so that we can make appropriate use of each of them during garment construction. Lengthwise grain runs along the length of the fabric. We identify the length of the fabric by the selvage, since the selvage runs through the length of the fabric. The yarns which run parallel to the selvage are called warp yarns, and it is actually these warp yarns which form the lengthwise grain. As I explained earlier, warp yarns are stronger and heavier and do not stretch much. Because of this property, the fabric pieces cut along these warp yarns are heavier and hang better. This lengthwise direction or grain is generally used to cut those garment pieces which need to fall from top to bottom. Pieces of fabrics used in the construction of any garment must conform to the functional and comfort needs of the specific body parts which they cover. So while cutting the garment, all the pattern pieces which are meant to hang down the body should be placed on the lengthwise grain. Therefore, front and back part of shirt, kurta, skirt, top, or even sleeves are cut along the lengthwise grain of the fabric flowing down the body. These fabric pieces generally hang from the top, and the heavier warp yarn prevents these pieces from sagging. Crosswise or widthwise grain runs along the width of the fabric, and fabric width runs from one selvage to the other selvage. These yarns which run perpendicular to the selvage are called weft yarns, and it is actually these weft yarns which form the widthwise grain. These weft yarns are more elastic and supple and also have a bit of stretch, and because of this property, the fabric pieces cut along these weft yarns will stretch and fit along the width of the body. Wider parts such as shirt collar, frills, waistband are, however, cut with their length positioned along the crosswise grain. This widthwise direction or grain is generally used to cut those garment pieces which are short and wider and run across the body, such as yoke, collar, cuff, belt, etc. Sometimes width-wise grain is also used to create certain design effects using the fabric patterns such as horizontal stripes or a border print along the selvage of the fabric. I hope till now you have understood that warp yarns create a lengthwise direction or grain and weft yarns create a widthwise grain. Now we will discuss the third type of grain, which is called bias, which is neither vertical nor horizontal. In fact, this falls in a diagonal direction. This diagonal direction can have any angle, but when bias grain has 45 degrees angle, it is called true bias. Patterns are normally placed on true bias on fabric if intended to cut on a bias grain. This bias grain has a special property of having the maximum amount of stretch. That means the fabric stretches the maximum when it is pulled in the diagonal direction. We use this property of the fabric in cutting those garment pieces in bias grain which needs stretch, such as curved armholes, necklines. Generally, bias grain is used for tight-fitted garments such as chudidar pajama, chudidar sleeves, etc. Because this grain provides stretchability to the fabric, particularly in those areas where the fitting is tight or very close to the body. While wearing these tight-fitted garments, the fabric is able to stretch and accommodate the tension created by the body movements and thereby minimizing the stress felt in the seams. Another important use of bias grain is in obtaining maximum flare in the fabric, particularly in those parts which require full flare, such as flared sleeve, puffed sleeve, umbrella skirt, umbrella cut kurta, etc. Bias grain is also used to cut strips or tapes which are used as facings or bindings for finishing curved edges such as necklines, armholes, etc. We've learned till now how the fabric pieces can be cut along different grains to utilize the properties of the grain. What we need to understand, both the human body and fabric have an up and down direction and a crosswise direction. Therefore, the fabric grain is also matched according to the body part where it is used. Apart from woven fabrics, knitted fabrics are also used in garment construction. Knitted fabrics are constructed by making interconnected loops. The concept of fabric grain is important in the case of knitted fabrics also. So if we try to observe the structure of a woven fabric, the woven fabric is made by interlacing two sets of yarns. Okay, the yarns which are running along the length of the fabric. Now, length is identified by this corner edge, which is called selvage. Okay, so selvage runs along the length of the fabric. So those yarns which are running along, which are running parallel to the selvage, they are called warp yarns. Okay, and the yarns which run perpendicular to the selvage, they are making right angles with the selvage. So these yarns which are running from one selvage to the other, these are called weft yarns. So every woven fabric would have two sets of yarns. One set of yarns is running along the length of the fabric. They are called warp yarns. And the other set of yarns would be weft yarns, which would be running across the width of the fabric. So each woven fabric would have warp yarns, weft yarns interlaced together, and then a selvage. Now this selvage is a thin strip of this area which is finished in itself, and it has a very tight weave along its edge. If we look at the various type of grains in a woven fabric, then we would see that there are three different type of grains. One is called the lengthwise grain. Now the lengthwise grain is in the direction of the warp yarns. So as we learned earlier that in a woven fabric, the warp yarns are the yarns which are running along the length of the fabric, which are parallel to the selvage. So these warp yarns are basically making the lengthwise grain. And the other grain is crosswise grain, which is made by the weft yarn. So weft yarn, as we learnt, that they run across the width of the fabric. So that means they are constructed, or they are interlacing with the warp yarns at right angles. That means they are perpendicular to the lengthwise grain or the selvage. So this direction in which the weft yarns are running will form the crosswise grain. So these two grains are in the direction of the yarns, and we have another grain which is the bias. Now this bias is the direction which is placed at an angle, but normally a true bias is actually 45 degrees angle and when the patterns are placed diagonally on this in this direction at a 45 degrees angle, then it is called a true bias. And normally a true bias is usually used when the patterns have to be placed in the bias grain. So each of these grains or directions in a woven fabric have their own set of properties, and depending on their properties, or depending on the requirements of the pattern pieces of a particular garment, the grain lines are used. Suppose we have a piece of fabric with us and we do not know which way is the warp yarns and which way is the weft yarn, and we have to identify the grain of the fabric. That means we need to identify which way are the warp yarns running and which way are the weft yarns running. So there is a simple way to identify. The simplest would be if in case your fabric has a selvage. If you can see a selvage, then it becomes very easy, because the selvage means that, selvage is running in the lengthwise direction. That means all the threads which are running parallel to the selvage, this is the lengthwise grain or the lengthwise direction or the direction of the warp yarn. And of course, the yarns which are running perpendicular to the selvage, that forms the crosswise grain. So it is very easy to identify in case the selvage is visible. But what if the fabric does not have any selvage? And then how would you identify the warp and the weft yarns, or the lengthwise grain or the widthwise grain? This can be done by a simple method, which is the stretching test. So basically you just test the stretchability of the different yarns. So that means in each of these directions, so they'd be like, one direction would be like this and the other direction would be like this. So basically you just need to stretch and see how much it stretches. So we know that the warp yarns are heavier and they do not stretch much, they are strong. And the weft yarns, they are supple and they have little elasticity. So wherever you see a little bit more stretch, and that is the direction where the weft yarns would be. So let's see how they are stretching. So here, one direction is this and the other direction is this. Grain in knitted fabrics is referred to as direction of the placement of loops in the fabric. The loops which run horizontally in a row are called cores, and each course represents the widthwise direction corresponding to the weft in a woven fabric. The term veil, on the other hand, represents the column of vertical loops and corresponds to the warps in a woven fabric. Knitted fabrics are also cut following the grain line marked in the pattern pieces, whether it is lengthwise, crosswise, or the bias direction. The correct use of the direction in knitted fabric is as important as the correct use of grains in woven fabrics. Garment pieces that are not cut on the correct fabric grain will lead to unaesthetic results such as sagging, ill-fitting, and pulling and puckering, and a general discomfort while wearing the garment. Now let's try to understand how to identify the fabric grain. Suppose we come across a woven fabric and we need to identify the lengthwise or crosswise yarns or grain. The simplest way is to locate the selvage. As we know by now, the yarns running parallel to the selvage would be warp yarns, creating the lengthwise or straight grain, and the yarns perpendicular to the warp yarns or selvage would form the widthwise grain. Now, if the fabric sample does not have any selvage, how do we then identify the warp and weft yarns? It can be done by testing the stretch on either side of the fabric and checking how much it stretches. The warp yarns, which form the lengthwise grain, will have the least amount of stretch. The weft yarns forming the crosswise grain will stretch relatively more than the warp yarns. Of course, fabric will stretch maximum when pulled in the bias direction. This way, you can easily identify the lengthwise or crosswise grain of the fabric. Sometimes, you may also be able to identify the grain by the tearing test, which means that you try to tear the fabric from either side of the fabric. Since warp yarns are generally stronger than the weft yarns, tearing becomes more strenuous along the width of the fabric from one selvage to the other, where you would have to break each of the warp yarns. But tearing along the lengthwise direction or grain would be easier if the weft yarns are weaker than the warp yarns. Though this test may not give you accurate results in the case of fabrics made of rib weaves or fancy weaves, now that we know the methods to identify the various grains, we will use this knowledge for properly laying out the pattern pieces on the fabric. As we already know, separate patterns are created for each of the individual parts of the garment. Now, each of these parts may be required to be cut on different grains depending on the requirements of the pattern pieces. Therefore, the information related to the grain to be used for cutting any particular pattern piece is indicated on the pattern itself through a symbol called grain line. This grain line symbol indicates the direction in which the pattern pieces will have to be placed on the fabric for cutting. Grain line is marked as a straight line with arrows at both the ends. Lengthwise or straight grain line is marked parallel to the center line of the pattern. Usually, the patterns of dresses, kurta, shirt, skirt, sleeves, etc. would have a lengthwise grain line marked on them. Widthwise or cross grain line is marked perpendicular to the center line of a pattern. Usually, the patterns of waistband, yokes, belts, etc. would have a widthwise grain line marked on them. Bias grain line is drawn at 45 degrees angle to the center line of a pattern. Patterns of fitted garments such as churidar pajama or flared garments such as flared skirt, puffed sleeve would have bias grain line marked on them. While placing the pattern on fabric, please take note that the grain line is always placed parallel to the selvage. It is important to mark the correct grain line on the pattern and place it on the correct fabric grain. If the grain line is not correct for the pattern piece, the stitched garment would have a distorted appearance. Therefore, it is essential to mark each pattern piece with the correct grain line. In certain cases, there may also be exceptions to the standard practice of using grain lines. We may also use fabric grain more creatively. Often you may see designers playing around with the fabric grain to create some interesting visual effects. However, it must be ensured that different use of grain should not lead to distortion in the garment fit and appearance. Such creative use of grain lines is done for two major reasons: to create interesting visual effects or to economize on fabric. Various fabric designs offer opportunities for creating interesting visual effects. For example, striped fabrics may be cut along the bias grain and stitching the pieces together to create a chevron effect. Similarly, smaller pieces such as pocket, collars, yoke, cuffs can be cut in a different grain to create a different visual effect. Another example of creating different effects in a striped fabric could be use of lengthwise grain in the center panel of the dress, accompanied by a bias grain in the side panels or yoke. This creative use of grain line is done selectively only for those pattern pieces which will not produce any distorted appearance of the overall garment. Another example of creating interesting effect in a fabric with a border print is by strategically positioning the placement of a garment hem or a yoke on the fabric border. Here, the visual effect of the garments get enhanced. Another reason for the creative use of fabric grain could be to economize on the fabric. For example, some smaller garment components such as collar, cuff or pocket may be cut on a different grain to save the fabric. It is also important to understand whether the fabric to be used for cutting has a proper grain alignment. While the fabric is woven, the weft and warp yarns are aligned in perfect right angles to each other. Such a fabric is known as on-grain fabric or grain-perfect fabric. Sometimes, due to certain processes, stretching or defects, the fabric may lose the right angle alignment between warp and weft. Fabrics with such distorted warp and weft alignment are called off-grain fabrics. If the pattern pieces are cut on an off-grain fabric, where the warp and weft are not aligned at right angles to each other, the constructed garment may hang poorly or have fitting problems. Therefore, the off-grain fabric will need to be straightened first as much as possible, and only then the pattern layout should be done on it. Sometimes the fabric can be straightened again to rectify the grain distortion, but sometimes, for example, when some finishes have been applied on the fabric and the grain distortion has happened, because of these permanent finishes, it may be difficult or impossible to make it grain perfect. However, in most of the cases, by using simple steps, it may be possible to straighten the fabric grain. The first step in the process is to identify the extent to which the warp and weft yarns are misaligned. The second step involves truing or blocking the grain. The identification of the extent of misalignment can be done in two ways. So when we talk of fabric grain, we are basically talking in terms of woven fabric. So most of the fabrics, if you look at them, you would see threads, these yarns or threads, coming out of the edges. So this is how you get to know that this fabric has been made by interlacing two set of yarns. So if you look at the fabrics, I have few fabric samples here, and if you observe them closely, you would see that there are yarns running along this edge also. They are coming out of the fabric edges, and there are yarns coming out from this edge as well. So it is basically the interlacing of different yarns. So this is a woven fabric. So if you look at the structure of a woven fabric, you would see that this woven fabric would have yarns running along the length of the fabric. So length is identified by the selvage. If you see, every woven fabric would have an edge which is self-finished edge from where you cannot, pull out the yarns, because this is, finished in itself. So every woven fabric would also have a selvage where the weaving has been done very closely and very tightly, and it is finished. So the fabric will have a selvage, and it will have, yarns running along the length, along the, parallel to the selvage, and then there'd be yarns running from one selvage to the other selvage. So this is how we, measure the width of the fabric, and the length of the fabric is measured along the selvage of the fabric. So you can see any fabric, and there are different types of selvages. You would see each fabric would have a different kind of a selvage. First is the tearing method, which is used for medium weight plain fabrics, where a small cut is made on any one of the selvages, and then the fabric is torn along that cut in a single fast motion. You would observe that the fabric tears along a single weft yarn, thereby exposing the extent of misalignment between warp and weft yarn. This tearing method should not be used on very fine, lightweight or expensive fabrics, or those fabrics with heavy embroidery or intricate weaves. The second method involves pulling out a single weft yarn from one side of the selvage. This method is more time consuming, and you would notice that the fabric gathers up while the weft yarn is being pulled out, and therefore care must be taken that the yarn does not break in between while pulling. When the weft yarn is pulled out fully, you would notice a blank row along the pulled out weft, and it will reveal the extent of misalignment between the warp and weft yarn. Now you have to cut the fabric from one selvage to the other along the path of the pulled out weft yarn. The second step of grain straightening, which is truing or blocking, is done after the extent of misalignment between the warp and weft is identified. In this process, the misaligned fabric edge is pulled diagonally along the bias grain till the fabric edge falls on a straight line. This pulling may not get you a perfect on-grain alignment, but will definitely improve the alignment between the warp and weft yarns. You may follow up this process with steam pressing the straightened fabric. When ironing the fabric, move the iron along the lengthwise grain. If the fabric still remains off grain, iron it along the weft or crosswise grain, but never iron in the bias direction. In today's session, we have discussed the concept, importance, and types of fabric grain. We also looked at ways to identify the grain and how they should be used. In addition, we also discussed the concept of grain line and grain straightening. Although the concept of grain and grain line may appear simple and may often be overlooked, however, if they are used incorrectly, they may cause a fit problem, or it may appear in the form of a poor fit or hang of the garment. The fabric grain also makes its presence felt when it is used creatively to create interesting visual effects. Hope you all enjoyed today's presentation and will make use of the knowledge gained in this session in your garment construction projects. Thank you.